Uh,
sold at like a 70% discount or something like that.
what a deal, huh? If only they could rezone that as affordable residential. I mean, it's a question. I mean, real talk here. I mean, that's the hard part right now. Is if we look at the price to rent ratio, one of the metrics where we describe if something is overvalued, it's out of whack across the country. The Bay Area does kind of its own thing there with a few reasons there. They're both expensive, but we're still overvalued in a lot of respects if we look at a lot of metrics for at least price ratios, which haven't come down enough to reflect the increase in mortgage rates that we've seen. So, no guarantee, but it's a rough road out there. And my heart goes out to all of you who've recently purchased a home.
Yeah, I'm looking to buy on the central coast of California. So
oh, nice. That's nice. Just commute in from the Big Sur somewhere.
Paso Robles.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. My girlfriend keeps asking whether we should buy this house or not. And I'm like, well, we have a webinar here in 10 minutes. Why don't you just join that and ask Dr. White yourself?
I know. And then those things, that's pretty cool though. I like where Paso Robles is located. It's cool. We were just down we went down the 101. We went down the one, I'm sorry, back in December, and Morro Bay is closed. You got all the fun stuff there. Cool area.
Cambria doesn't have running water. I mean, it's running out of water. That's been an issue.
But nothing a little Albert ingenuity can't fix when you have your 25-acre estate on the
25. Yeah, well, we'll host our own version of Davos over there.
That's right. You can have your own vineyard. And
maybe we can make our own Bretton Woods agreement.
That's exactly right. We make it own. Just lock the doors like the United States did in 1944.
We'll develop the Riley dollar.
Oh yeah, that's right. Make whatever I say the only currency convertible to gold.
Yeah.
I wish I had that much. No, I don't wish for that much authority. That'd be horrifying. But that's super good. I mean, that's really exciting. I mean, the thing is, right now, if it seems, time, values, these things are all. For a thing like Sean Riley dollar, no, I don't want Sean. Sean shouldn't. Sean's usurping. He is a proper Riley by the definition of the term. But thanks, Colin, for answering the question live.
He's gonna institute a coup d'état and institute his own dollar.
Yeah, it's a Riley. It's an entire subculture of economics. It's Riley's. First
Riley
names, last names.
Oh
man.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and let Colin do his thing when he feels like he's ready.
Oh, well, you normally give 5 minutes. Let's give 2 more minutes for people. I see them trickling in. I'm peeking ahead at the slides.
But actually, for those who are here, this is kind of your between the scenes moment before I think we are live right now, but
we are live.
Jump into the formalities of everything. You're more than welcome to ask questions, make comments, put Dr. White on the hot seat. He is a PhD, so he's looked at economics more than the collective of all of us here, and he's an expert on it.
You guys are awesome. The Bay Area is fantastic, and even if you're from afar or near, it is great, sir.
So if you're afraid of a recession, ask about that. If you think AI is going to take your job, I mean, who knows? Maybe
there we go.
Maybe Dr. White thinks AI is transitory too.
Oh yeah, this is a good question. We're going to talk a little bit about AI today, Bill, and I appreciate the question. AI is already taking jobs. How do we respond? So this is really interesting. So kind of giving away the future realm here. So this is really interesting. So there's been a lot of debate about this in aggregate. So obviously there is the notion of and so we're seeing a couple things right now. So yes, our firm's saying, well, I don't know if I'll hire for this role or this role. The question is it AI driving that, or ultimately is that just the pullback that we're seeing on consumer spending happening? And it's probably a combination of a lot of things. Going back, there's actually a really good article in The Economist this week, if you caught it, on the AI, only on the promise of AI and sort of the economic debate that underlies it. And this all goes all the way back to something that happened, back in the 1960s. Economists were looking at this question, and one of the ways that we've looked at technology and how it advances society is that, oh, technology, does this thing and it rapidly increases productivity, and that creates a situation that, society grows, productivity increases. But if we study things like railroads in the 1800s, one of the interesting and groundbreaking works of the 1960s in this paper, they found that railroads, and this is true, railroads didn't have that much of an advantage over the preceding technology, which was canals, and we probably would have gotten there equally fast anyway, in terms of productivity growth and other things. So AI is going to be manifesting itself as a tool across the board. High exposure jobs are going to have some interesting times, and it's all about adaptation. And I'm going to have a really long explanation into what this is. Yeah, we're more and more indentured. That's Bill. That's a very good. See, that's true in some respects. I certainly see that angle that you're coming from here and saying, technology is this force, and it can do so many things that can often be toxic to our society, and it can create these negative externalities. It can be really which are a bummer. But at the same time, it is an interesting thing. It relies on our ability to create an adaptation to the technology at hand, often lags technological growth. But I've got a few slides dedicated to AI, and we'll look at some angles here, look at productivity, where the opportunity lies, what people are saying across the board, and what's the rational exposure into this. So, there's a lot of things out there that I think at the end of the day that AI can help with, especially one broad question to the audience is, have you ever done something in your job that you feel is menial, or if you feel like, gosh, I wish there was anything else that would do this? I feel that's like, I'm a college administrator as well as a professor, and I'm like, I feel like that's like 80% of my job is doing things that I wish I could just instruct.
You're gonna end up having, Riley GPT.
That's right, Riley. I would love to have AI personally, have the ability to interact with AI in a way where it interprets what I'm doing. Imagine my research writing. Research papers. I could just pose a question, and it collects the data for me. It's like 10 RAs at once and pops out the greatest research article ever made. Then the entire, value of college model from a professor's point of view goes out the window. But it's going to be really fun to see. It's going to be a couple of decades of fun we got ahead of us, everybody. So strap into the fun seats. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. Technology can be used by elites or the deep pockets. Others are just spectators and wage slaves. That's always, that's the thing. That's sort of the historical society. That's the history of the world. And they were saying that about the plow too, but it's a thing.
All right. There's 17 attendees, so I feel like we should get the ball rolling. Everybody, welcome. It's a nice Wednesday. It's very sunny and warm. This is the April 2023 jobs report. And today we're going to cover AI, jobs, inflation, bank collapses, and whether or not your job is going to be taken over. As always, joining us is Dr. Riley White, Associate Dean from University of New Mexico. I think I got that right. Yeah. And Professor of Finance and all around very smart person with regards to economics. I'm just here to ask questions and moderate, and passing it on to Dr. White.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you, everybody. Welcome to the April 2023 version of the jobs report and inflation report, here taking place in May, because that's when we get the data. So thank you so much for coming on board. We're so excited to have you, so excited for you guys to come out, especially, I know it is a Wednesday evening. You'd rather be, hopefully you're still at work and using this as a way to distract yourself from the task at hand. Maybe you're observing AI as it writes programmatic code for you in some form, and you're just managing it as you proceed throughout the day. But anyway, let's rock and roll with this thing. I'm going to share my screen for you, and we will start with some shenanigans. As always, I do always appreciate questions on here, and I know it's one of those things that if you look at this and you're like, well, really, you're coming from all kinds of angles. I know some of you have done a lot of work in the economic sphere. You can ask questions if you've done other things outside of this, and you're new to this field. It's okay to ask questions about how does this work. You can also I will be monitoring the chat as well. So if you're worried about, I won't call you out on anything one way or another, I won't say your name. If you send me a direct message like that, I try to protect that level of privacy so you can feel comfortable doing it. So anyway, let's talk a little bit about this. We're going to talk about the jobs report, how the market is doing right now. We're going to talk about inflation, and then we're going to talk about some of the things that are happening across the economy. I've got some new charts to toss your way, a couple of old ones that if you've tuned in before in previous months, that are still relevant, and then we're going to go forward with these. So what a time to be alive. So let's talk about the April 2023 jobs report for everybody. So what we have here is a jobs report, which was okay. It was pretty good. We're holding pretty well. Remember that jobs reports are past looking. They're lagging indicators of economic growth. And so I'm going to switch gears in a few slides and talk about leading indicators, stuff that predict how the economy will pan out in the next few months. But here's the thing. The interesting part is the economy is holding its own, relatively speaking. In a normal time where we didn't have that big push up from the pandemic to where we are today, this would be considered a pretty good jobs report. By most standards of the word, we have growth solidly across all of the major sectors. We added about 253,000 jobs. Unemployment remains low, about as low as we can ever get it. This is, in other words, as good as it gets, 3.4%. Not so for the Bay Area, which we'll discuss a little bit later. The Bay Area unemployment is almost the same. It's atypical, though. Usually the Bay Area has lower unemployment than other parts of the country, given its historic and meteoric history as an engine of economic growth. But we'll talk about that for a while. So unemployment is the only direction, as Albert points out. Is it the only direction to go is up? Perhaps. So we'll see about how and when that will happen. We are seeing cracks still, but it's a slow. It's like I mean, this pathway is slowly cracking egg. We know that there are cracks in consumer spending. We know there are other issues. We'll get into some of those things. But right now, at least if we look at this, sunshine, rainbows, and unicorns, it's a slow burning recession. We got the sort of the long wick on this one as opposed to the COVID-19 one. So 80.8% of workers, and this was a really interesting tidbit of today. So a lot of people say, oh my goodness, are people dropping out of the market left and right? And there's not all these 25 to 54. The ages 25 to 54 are that's the core age of the economy. That's where people occupy the biggest space. After the age of 54, of course, we get a lot of sliding off from retirees. Before age 25, we have a lot of education. So people focus on the 25 to 54 employment levels because they're looking at the question of, how are we doing relative to this market? Are people in the prime working age? Do they have jobs? And most of them do, about 80.8%, in fact. This is actually higher than the pre-pandemic peak of 80.6% in January 2020. Again, sunshine, rainbows, unicorns, pretty good. So this is really interesting. So as opposed to this too, and Albert points out a good thing in the chat window, he was looking at 2008 as an example. The Fed had a rate hike program started in 2004, ended in 2006. I was a banker back in those days, 2006, then started lowering rates in September 2007, and a year later, the bottom fell out. That's true. And then in the following that timeline, we're right near the end of 2006 or 2007. Do you think the government would let the bottom fall out in a year with an election on the horizon? That's a really good question. So the Fed, of course, independent agency, although the Congress gets together and they appoint the Fed chair and the president appoints them and the Congress votes on it, whoever that is, the Fed is considered an independent body. And so as a consequence, the Fed is focused ultimately on what's called, they call the dual mandate, which is keeping inflation at 2% or below and keeping employment maximum, the maximum employment possible, which we are kind of at if we look at historical data. And so the Fed's going to look at this. And so the Fed will probably be agnostic to the question of recessions and so much that it causes a recession. If the Fed were activist around this measure and they were really worried about a particular, and they wanted to keep the government currently in power, they'd probably pull back a bit on the rate hikes. And that's not really a factor in their mind. They're trying to do their job and trying to minimize inflation. So the question is would this be enough? And I would say, though, that anytime we have economic struggles of any form, that does increase, and I defer to one of my friends from high school, went to MIT, got a PhD in political science. He writes a lot on this topic about the nature of elections and the nature of these things that influence election outcomes. And one of the outcomes that are always ultimately discussed are, economic matters as it pertains to the election. It is a disadvantage. When the economy is doing poorly, it is a disadvantage for the incumbent government. And that is something that would be potentially stressful in the upcoming iteration in election cycle in 2024. And so that's the really hard part, is the nature of how and when this unwinds. Often we're right about the thesis as a field of the economy or finance. We know about where we're going to go, but the timeline for that is often a little bit wrong. As it was said with one of the cities and towns that I consult with, one of the mayors was like, "Where's my recession, Riley?" I'm like, "I'm working on it. I'm trying as hard as I can to manufacture a recession." No, I'm not. I want to be wrong about a recession coming in next year, but it is likely for reasons we'll talk about. We're still near the lowest unemployment in as Colin points out in this article, lowest unemployment level 54 years. We're still rocking that. And this is as low as it gets. Now, unemployment's one of those tricky numbers, right? So unemployment is only measured if you're part of the labor force, meaning you have to have a job or you have to be looking for a job. If you drop out of labor force, you're not part of that employment question. And so that is ultimately something to question with. So Sean says the Fed chair doesn't take orders from politicians. They don't care. They don't care about what the politicians say. That's true. They are an independent body, Sean, to my point, but I also argue that, to certain extents, I can't say they don't not care fully about the question of what politicians say, as many chairs can be influenced by them indirectly or directly, but it's hard to say when your job, say your term comes due and you're due potentially to be reappointed or not reappointed, to care. But in that sense, in the purest economic and financial sense, it's an apolitical argument. It's a space where their ultimate focus is on the economic health of the United States, which is what we ultimately hope they will be focused on. So let's talk about a little bit about this jobs report here. So we added about 77,000 in health education and healthcare jobs across the country. Of that 253,000, 40,000 were actually in healthcare specifically. Now, healthcare is robust. And if you're tossing me a line for the next 20 years of the types of sectors that we're going to see continued growth demands on, and things where we need to really operate in a space where we're looking at a lot of potential improvements. And, for example, we have chronic areas of the country, here, coming from my position here, despite, having experience in various parts of the country, at University of New Mexico, like many areas of the country, is experiencing a physician shortage. We lost about 30% of our general care practitioners between 2017 and 2021. And some of these programs here, we're working on grants, other things to get doctors who are here from other countries, but they can't practice due to the licensure and other restrictions that are on them. And so it becomes a really difficult thing to say, hey, well, there's all these opportunities, but by the way, we don't have a means to give you a residency or to get you into the United States in that manner. So we're looking at alternative roles for them within the healthcare system. Healthcare is really robust. It does well in recessions. It's going to do better just sheerly demographically in the United States in the next few years, because we're getting older and we need more of that additional care. 43,000 jobs were added in professional and business services across the country. That is a good number for this. All those supporting jobs from accountants all the way down. Some of that, I guess, is going to be related to tax season, temporary work, and other things. About 23,000 in government jobs as well. So it's very, very interesting. So only wholesale trade lost jobs. My apologies there. Wholesale trade is down about 2%. That's not bad. I was pleased to see the construction industry, which had lagged. We saw some layoffs earlier this year in construction caused by just the spigots turning off on residential construction because of higher mortgage rates. And construction's been bouncing back a little bit. We expect to see this uptake in summer because that's a big building season for most of the country. Everything from the construction workers themselves, as well as to all the public works projects that are coming through, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, Joe Cardillo's here. That's fantastic. This is probably jumping ahead, but which industries do you think are currently masking job loss to automation? Mining, energy, where the number of on-rig jobs no longer easily predicts the health of the industry. That's actually pretty cool. We were just talking about that, Joe. I gave an economics presentation to the Construction Financial Management Association last week. And we were just talking about this field in particular, because if we look at aggregate data, it's really hard because one of the aspects, if you look at areas of the country with a lot of oil activity, they often report a prevalence of construction workers. And some of that is due to substitution effects. We know that construction workers arrive at a place, they might be operating in spaces in the construction industry that are due to the oil industry or directly involve the oil industry in some way, especially as they're increasing. But there's also some effects where they can they look for opportunities. You can have a choice of construction or work for that oil rig job as it comes due. And so they typically attract large numbers of construction workers who are looking for a shot at the higher wages in the oil industry. But the way that we classify these industries, to your point, Joe, is very tricky. And from the survey point of view, and these are determined ultimately by surveys, there are classification errors and classification challenges that make looking at the minutiae of these discussions very, very challenging to do. And so to your point is job loss is due to automation can, of course, be masked in different ways or other ways as well. We look at, are people filling in other parts of the system? And the nature of that question is very complex. And I like that so much that you ask it. But this is something that we're going to be studying, I think, for a decade ahead of time, in the nature of how this works. Also, the hard part is one response, logical response to job losses that you suffer due to replacement in some way is you drop out of the labor force in some way. So this includes a large number of people who might retire early. This includes a large number of people who drop out and you go from a two or multiple income household to a single income household due to that. And I know that one of the areas in the country that we need to really improve on is that labor force training mechanism, which we've seen many programs start, and there's many good programs out there, but ultimately as a whole, that becomes, in the nature of how we respond to that also becomes an important solution for the AI developments that we see in the future. So that's a really good, I love that question, Joe. So labor force, structural unemployment, always talking about structural employment, Sean. And this is things that that we can measure. The question is the why are they structurally unemployed? And that becomes hard, and that's the source of open debate across our system as to how it works, to your point. So we talk about this, and labor force participation remains steady at about 62.6%. And that's pretty, that is okay. Back then, to give you a little quick history on labor force participation, we reached our apogee of labor force participation about 20 years ago, right before the tech bubble burst, about 2000. And that means that that's everybody who is of working age, 16 older, are working. But what's happened since then is that despite, a lot of demographic changes to the 70s, 80s, and 90s, baby boomers coming online, working, women entering the workforce in mass in ways they hadn't been able to in previous decades. Since 2000, we're suffering a lot of strategic demographic declines across the board. We're getting older as a society. Those workers are dropping off. We're suffering from a population pyramid problem that exists in almost all developed countries across the world, and some developing countries as well. Albert said, would there be a situation where labor force participation is 100%? Apart from very specific gulags, of which I don't have a lot of experience working in myself, there's a very difficult question where you say, I'm above a certain age, and I'm working. Yes, the North Korean problem. Look at the workforce participation in North Korea, no government debt. Wow, what a great place. Can't wait to vacation there. No, it's really hard because at some level beyond a certain age, you end up with retirees who just by the nature of retiring or being no longer able to work, drop out of that labor force. If they were still looking for a job, technically they would be counted as an unemployed worker, but that will affect the participation rate. Also, things that affect the greater participation rate are greater disability levels. And that's affected us, especially in the last 20 years across the country in varying aspects. Some of the states with lower participation levels, this is West Virginia, Alabama, Mississippi, New Mexico, have often very high corresponding levels of physical disability and impairment that keeps people from being able to engage the workforce in a meaningful way. And then average hourly earnings rose about 16 cents. Now, this is really interesting because wage growth kind of did this little thing where wage growth wasn't really floating around. Wage growth is back up to about 4% over the year. Is that good? No, because inflation's still 4.9%. Ultimately, it's nice when wages exceed inflation. And in this case, that's simply not the case. But in some sectors, they're doing better than others. But hourly earnings rose about 16 cents, which is not bad. So overall, here's what you got as an overall picture here. I know depending on the resolution and your availability and my availability to come through your window today, this is a unemployment. This is you might be able to view this or not. I'll zoom it up for the people in the cheap seats in the bleachers. So we're looking at manufacturing, construction, government, leisure, and hospitality, all reporting strong gains. Will this be the case in the future? We'll talk about that in 1 second. But anyway, let's go down quickly first and talk about the inflation report. So inflation came out. Last month it was 5%. It went down to 4.9. We had some worries that it would be slightly at 5. We expected it to be around 5%. and it actually went slightly below. And some of this was caused, of course, by a fear that rising energy costs as we approach spring would push us over a bit. At this point, it was mainly a psychological part to say that, oh my goodness, we're going to arrest the steady decline that we've seen in the chart in the right of our inflation rate. But inflation was more or less flat. There are some concerns within that, though. Core inflation, which is, we take out the volatile energy and food, is still humming along at 5.5%, which is pretty high, relatively speaking. Used cars and trucks were up. They reversed a couple months of declines, and we're actually up about 4.4%. Slightly good news as food prices were flat. Energy rose 0.6%, but energy has been falling back a little bit this month, which should be reflected in May's numbers. Super core inflation rose about 0.4% in April, and it's up about 3.7% from last year. What's super core? That's the Fed's preserved number. That's our inflation, less things like food, energy, and also shelter. So basically, none of the stuff you actually worry about. But the Fed pays attention to this because they're trying to get a sense of how service sector inflation, how service sector, a very tricky inflation to control, that is on things ranging from the services we have from our lawyer bills, accounting bills, haircuts, all that stuff. They want to keep this under control because it has such an impact on the lives of consumers. And it's up about 3.7% from last year, and it rose still 0.4%. So the Fed's going to look at this, and I think they're going to look at this and they're going to come to the conclusion that I don't think we talk about, are they going to raise rates again? Probably so. I think, at this point I was on the fence about this, but if super core remains high, and not just talking about the Fed cycle through summer, but it is possible they could squeeze out another increase of 0.25 from that. I think the economic headwinds, though, are enough to beg pause. To give a quick recap over the last year, food at home is up still about 8% with electricity, shelter, everything, all the stuff, that we have to deal with is up 8%. New cars are up 5%. Hooray. Transportation services. I don't know how you feel about the BART, but overall transportation services are up about 11%. Food outside, food at home. This is a really good question because, Albert, you point out something interesting. We saw an acceleration of restaurant prices in response to labor shortages that were being passed along to the consumers. And those labor shortages, due to a number of factors. Obviously, when the pandemic hit in 2020, you had unemployment shoot up in the double digits across the country, and it hit leisure and hospitality really hard. Obviously, if you've ever been a leisure and hospitality worker before, you're not sitting by the phone waiting for somebody to call the restaurant to call you back that you worked at 3 months ago. So by the time consumer spending shot up again, due to many parts of the stimulus spending that occurred, those jobs were not able to be filled. And so as a response, the wage growth in leisure and hospitality led all the other sectors in the following year and a half in response to these structural changes. Muni is nicer, but I still prefer to drive. I hear you, Christopher. I hear you. It's one of those things. Driving is comfortable. You get choice. I try to buy a really big radio show. Riley, I could be a radio show host if I wanted. That's so nice. I was on the radio yesterday for our local thing, and then I was on Marketplace earlier this week, and those were both fun, and nobody shared that opinion, Christopher, but if I could give you an A+, I'll give you an A+. That's one of those things. Colin, what's going on?
Can we talk about this inflation thing a bit?
Yes.
These numbers, none of these numbers are clear. Would you say they're good? Let's start.
Do I like 4.9%? No, I don't like this. I don't like core. I don't like a lot of things, Colin, but this is what I got. But it's getting better than it was last year in June when it peaked at 9.1.
Yes, it's getting better. We know the Fed wants to hit 2%. So working backwards from their goal, assuming a time horizon of 12 months, what do you expect to see happening in the jobs market, in the economy, in the stock market, and just general things that 2%?
All right, so this is the fun part. So a couple months ago, you may have seen this, the Cleveland FOMC, or the Federal Open Market Committee, came out with this joint, Cleveland Fed and the FOMC, came out with this little paper where they were talking about, okay, if there's no recession, when are we going to hit 2% again, or 2.5% in the inflationary numbers? And they estimated 2025. So the thing is what's a good way to reduce inflation? So if we continue doing monetary policy that's this way, which means higher rates, and we somehow avoid a recession, it's going to take a long time to get inflation back to those target numbers, Colin. But there is, of course, a solution, and the solution is horrifying. And that's why Jerome Powell has that kind of glint in his eye, and he has that sparkle of diabolical intentions when he's like, we're going to reduce inflation at whatever cost it's necessary to reduce inflation. He means that if a recession happens, that is one real quick way to get inflation out of the market. Because if we think about what a recession is, that's negative economic growth. That has an impact on firms. You obviously saw very famously, you may have seen the news in the last day, Home Depot releasing some numbers. I think we're going to see a lot more of that this summer. Here's the expectation for what our profits will be. And then this negative surprise. That happens because consumers aren't spending in the ways that they were before. And we're seeing this. Consumers are cash strapped. They don't have the money. What goes first? Those luxury items. I'm going to put less gardening equipment out there. I'm going to put less plantings in this time. There's going to be a lot of cutbacks that we make, starting with those optional factors. And so when that happens, that removes some economic activity from the system. And if it happens over a period of time, companies look and say, well, then we have to look at cost cutting. Then they look at labor cutting. And then you look at unemployment starting to rise. So to get your bottom line question, if unemployment goes up about 0.5%, I would say if we hit above 4% unemployment, that's a significant negative impact from where we are now, which is 3.4%. Is that enough for a recession? Maybe not, but it's indicative that the job market has to start cooling down in these areas. And if it goes up to 5%, we're entering a territory now where the economy is starting in a position where it's adjusting to negative economic externalities that will take the fire out of the inflation numbers, which is the good news, but it's also going to mean negative job consequences. And that is the other side of it. So the long way is that it'll take a couple years to continue down this magical slope to 2%. It'll gradually diminish like this, and there's no recession, sunshine, rainbows. But then the other side of this is more likely, and what the general consensus is, we'll probably find ourselves in some manner of a recession, which will correct the inflationary crisis, but at the cost of jobs, and it will be the cost of those people who are involved in different sectors. So that's the downside. So less spending, less consumer spending, less consumer demand, that takes some of that, and it's stricter lending, which we'll talk about next. All those things add to a deflationary rather than inflationary environment. And the issue with recessions is ultimately the fear of deflation, which is why the Fed likes to inject cash at all times, like they did during the Great Recession, when they put a lot of money in and all these different things to make things happen. So, shenanigans, Colin, shenanigans. What do you think, Colin?
Well, that doesn't paint a good picture, and no one clearly likes to hear recession. So assuming we hit the point of recession, do you expect it to be a quick one like 2020 or a long one?
Good. Very good question. It depends entirely on the response of the government. And when I say that, I mean that, so there's the right response to make. I will posture this. Having a $5 trillion stimulus was wonderful in getting us out of the pandemic recession, as Albert pointed out, 14% unemployment numbers. But it was actually perhaps too much money, and it was not perhaps, undoubtedly too much money in the sense that it forced a lot of economic problems at once that are caused by just an influx of cash, including inflation. And the government would have, and the Fed, and by the government, I mean, I'm also grouping the Fed into here, they would have to respond proactively. So if the Fed cut rates and opened, say, alternative means, and it depends, it's too early to tell where we might face liquidity issues, but if they were able and open to keep those channels open, and the government, the question is would the government be in a position to issue or perhaps issue a stimulus? And that's a very good question. Right now, we're obviously in the midst of a debt ceiling finagle right now, which, a lot of us, the general consensus of the field is this is like a weird sort of brinkmanship, showmanship concern, which will somehow sort itself out as sort of both political parties reach a compromise, because the real effects of it would be devastating to that point. And, and I think about that in the sense that, we're looking at the question of fiscal austerity that always creates a negative economic feedback loop in some respects, but it also, for the long run, also preserves our ability to grow. And one of the biggest drags on an economy can be a large debt load in the future. And so we're trying to balance those things in certain ways. And obviously, we hope and if we were in a healthy system, we'd be working on paying down that debt in good times, and then stimulating the economy in bad times by taking out debt in the Keynesian view, right? And that's sometimes available to us, sometimes not available to us. And right now, at least since the mid-90s, we've been spending more money than we have. But the other side of that, of course, is the revenue side. And we have to look at our tax structure. We have to look at the way things are paying out and all those other things. But that is a situation that, if it isn't, roped in the next 2 weeks, can be a bit of that would be a certainty of creating an economic downturn that would be severe.
Yes.
And I reflect on this only because 1979, in April, we had a tranche of US debt around 130 million. And I think I responded to 130 million, so 120 million, I think, that accidentally defaulted on part of their debt. And it was a computer error. The computer that was processing these debt repayments in 1979, obviously, it's obviously somebody's doing the hand crank on this machine, and each transistor is the size of is the size of a Duplo Lego block. And you have these things, and I'm sure its computing power was limited. But the point is we made this mistake. And because we made this mistake, and although it was a technicality, we ended up paying on that $100 million of debt an additional 0.6% on the interest rate of all our other debt in the economy, adding collectively to a total of 40 billion in additional fees. So if you think about the consequences when it comes down to that, it would be bad. So another thing to just put in your list of, in what I call the carousel of economic worries that we're riding along in this magical fair, Colin.
Okay, so bring it back to the inflation and recession.
Yeah. Tell me
You
about that.
mentioned that it sounds like Jay Powell is implying he's willing to take the recession route instead of the soft landing. Is that what you think he's thinking? I think
everybody wants a soft landing, but I think he's hoping that he's okay with a minor recession, not a severe one. I think right now, in his calculations and the nature of who works at the Fed and what they're processing, they're thinking that if we increase rates like this and we respond in certain ways, in response to X, Y, Z, in response to these economic numbers, we start reducing rates in response to this. So everything, I guess, is going to be formulaic and dependent on what the actual economic data has. But if that, and he's basically come out and said, inflation is the priority. He's actually said this very unequivocally, in fact, that inflation is the priority. And it's very secondary to look at things if we happen to have a recession. And this was actually one of that Q&A that he was back and forth on. A reporter asked him this and said, do you have, what if this puts us in a recession? And inflation has costs associated with it as well. And from an economic perspective, what he's looking at is the aggregate costs of inflation. Despite good unemployment numbers, it is very hard to control if we don't control it, and the risks to the economy. And if we look at the Fed as also being in the game of risk management, if we look at the risk that inflation poses in the economy for either getting out of control or being in a situation that creates a poor economic outcomes, those costs, while not as delivered and not as not as direct, perhaps, as me losing my job in a recession, are worse in his view than the loss of certain jobs in the economy, because the Fed has a playbook to get us out of that recession. So it's okay to put us in it if it controls inflation.
Okay.
And that's more of that's a Fed. This is why economists and finance people were no fun at parties. We're like, I'm losing my job, and I'm like, well, it's for the greater good of the economy, and I run these, and that's a terrible thing to point out. But that's exactly what their thinking is. I'm trying to translate this into this, because inflation it's a terrible beast to slay. And there's a whole bunch of data that shows lost GDP, productivity, growth, and all these externalities that happen if you have prolonged inflation like we did in the 70s. And that created sort of this school of monetary economics. There's also this other school that suggests that, hey, inflation of 3 or 4% isn't bad, because obviously that's one way we can inflate away our debts if we manage our other fiscal realm well. But right now he's targeting that 2% in the crosshairs and trying to get us down there, Colin. So it's going to happen. So yes, he'll be okay with a little recession, But when the numbers turn sour, I think the Fed will change its tune. But they haven't seen that yet. Still playing the hits. We look at the jobs report.
All right. Thank you for illuminating us there. I'll let you take the next slide.
Okay, does that make sense, Colin? Did I answer it, Colin? Hold me to the
made sense.
fire, Colin. Okay, good.
It made sense. It made sense. I understood all of it, I think.
I'm just a guy on the internet. It's not a real thing. But anyway, no, form your own opinions, and I do want you to form your own opinions. And I'm so grateful. Is everyone still here? No, everyone left. All right, one of those things. I'm so glad. So anyway, let's talk a little bit about, so those are previous economic indicators. We measured those in the past. What do we use in economics and finance to predict the future? Where are our crystal balls? What leading economic indicators are out there? And one of the sources we use is provided by the Conference Board. It's called the Leading Economic Index, and it's a list of 10 indicators that have a high correlation in predicting future economic outcomes. And they're not something that you would consider. So one of those things could be things like their financial components are 3 of them, non-financial components are 7 of them. So financial components include a leading credit index, an S&P 500 index of stock prices, and the interest rate spread on 10-year T-bills, bonds, less Fed funds. The credit index, what's the business activity happening? The global credit impulse fell off a cliff late last year as rates shot up. How are people originating and looking at the question of new debt and new loans? S&P 500 across the board. Leading credit index has a lot of factors. It also includes manufacturing orders and a few other things. And it's got all kinds of things that indicate, the nature of the credit system in the country. The S&P 500, the index of stocks is not really a good indicator in itself because it's responding, it is itself can be very volatile, but it is forward-looking. The stock index is basically one big index of companies based on their perceived ability to generate future profits and returns. And then the interest rate spread, which is this 10-year T-bond net less Fed funds rate. But it also includes non-financial components like the ISM, when we think about manufacturing orders coming down the line, what are consumer expectations of business conditions? People like me out here talking about the bad future economy, not helping that any. Building permits, though, very relevant factor. Are people building new houses? What are the average weekly hours of manufacturing? In other words, are people working more or less? New orders in manufacturing, consumer goods, new orders for non-defense, and average initial claims for unemployment insurance. Everything on the left, if it's a negative number, it's bad. And as you can see, we got a lot of negative numbers floating out there in our system. We have 2 slightly positive numbers. One is manufacturing new orders and the S&P 500. But overall, the system is bad. Now, how bad is it? If we put this together in an index and we follow its pathway through time, it becomes a really good indicator of a potential recession. Right now, we know that if we follow the leading economic 6-month growth rate, when it hits negative, it does create a warning signal. And when it goes negative below 4%, it creates what we call a recession signal. And so right now we are full in recession signal mode. And it's the longest we've ever been in either warning or recession mode without actually having a recession. So are we special? Is the the market by which we determine whether or not our economic conditions will be good or bad in the future, is this broken? And I don't think so, but I think there's a lot of weird things in the economy that are still happening because we have a very interesting recovery economy, post-COVID-19 recession, and we have a situation where the market is taking a long time to adjust to all of these different factors. And these things unravel for years, and it takes a while, as we talked about and Albert pointed out with 2008, to actually get us to the point of a recession. But right now, this is a strong indicator that says bad things are happening. But what else about it? Let's talk about delinquency, and not just our ability to show up on a day to work or my students' ability to show up to class, rising delinquency and auto loans. So when we think about delinquency, we have delinquency, I'm late, and then we have serious delinquency, I'm over 90 days late. And it's very interesting how across the platform where the burden of serious delinquency is falling. And so right now, especially among younger people, 18 to 29, we have the highest levels since the Great Recession of automotive delinquency, caused, of course, by incredibly very both higher prices across new and used vehicles, as well as those higher rates. And we, of course, reached very high automotive loan rates in the last year and a half or so. And cars churn quicker than houses in the terms of the amount of time people might actually own one, change them. Certain aspects of cars make them unpredictable. They can break down at any time. You have to get a new car whether you want to or not. And as a consequence, that puts a lot of people in some serious financial straits. But delinquencies are rising for most age groups, with the exception of some senior citizens who are able to make it out okay. When we look at consumer credit outstanding, we're at new highs. When we look at percent of disposable income, though, consumer credit outstanding doesn't look so bad. Although we have about over $1 trillion of consumer credit as a percent of our disposable income, it's not that high. Should we be worried? And I think it's important to put this in perspective. It depends. We have a tale of two economies. If you're doing well and earn very high salaries, it is true. Your revolving debt probably isn't that much. But for a lot of Americans in particular, and of course, if we weight these values to values that are reflective of their relative income and debt levels, we're going to have higher levels. It is higher across the board for certain income groups. Lower income groups in particular make them more vulnerable. But combine this back with the very low savings rate. We're still hovering around a 3% savings rate, which is one of the lowest levels we've had on record. So it means that we're relatively unprepared for the consequences of job losses if and when they occur. So the debt's going up. Consumers are still trying to spend, still trying to make it through, and they're relying more on debt than before. But right now, it's not as bad as it has been in previous years, notably 2007, 2008, when we were in the midst of that real estate bubble. What do you guys think? Questions?
Sean says there is little incentive to hold cash in an inflationary environment, which is true.
Absolutely right.
My thing was, like 3 slides earlier, you just established Jay Powell is willing to risk a recession to inflation, but now we're talking about how people cannot probably withstand a job loss scenario.
Right. And so to answer Sean's question too, as well, savings, of course, isn't the same as cash. So that's the other thing. When we talk about the savings numbers, we're talking about the money people physically save as a percentage of the income that they bring in. Now, savings, hopefully it's not kept in cash, to your point. And Sean's right. I'm hoping people are putting it in at least competitive money market accounts or doing something that at least gets them that return. But I think it's actually, I would argue that this is more of a symbol of consumer stress. And what wakes the Fed, so the Fed interprets a large amount of economic data at once, and they're going to be looking at things like consumer stress in general. But it's really hard because a lot of the consumer metrics we have are weighted towards, we are a consumer-driven economy. About 2/3 of our GDP comes from consumer spending. That's why it's so important to look at what consumers are doing and where they spend money. But there are cracks in sort of the veneer of consumer spending. We had so much spending, consumers were keeping it up. I think it is a factor of inflation too, that we are coming back and looking at consumers saying, they're looking at their budgets and affordability. They've been able to keep up spending to certain levels, and I think it's not maintainable. But again, a lot of our consumers also driven by higher income people and a higher income discretionary spending, which in terms of the luxury market, I mean, that's still humming along quite well because there's a lot of very wealthy people doing a lot of very wealthy expending right now. And I think that's going to continue until we enter sort of a situation of more drastic losses. But I think it's a really, it's a, your mileage may vary situation. But you're absolutely right. There's little incentive to hold cash in inflationary, but I'm not talking about cash. I'm talking about the savings rate and the savings rate incorporating other things. So we're not spending a lot. Consumers are getting a little stressed out in certain sectors. And this is something that often why, you look at the data coming up, the next step will be corporations, and look to those earnings numbers as they come out. You've seen a few of them. We're going to have a few more in summer when companies, some fiscal years end on June 30th. You'll get that number about a month later for a lot of these companies. See how they're doing and see how they respond to consumer spending. And if it's a more widespread phenomenon, it could be a signal that consumers are pulling back. That means companies will respond in kind, and that's where you get those widespread or potentially more widespread job losses in the market. But hopefully, again, not hoping that will happen, but I hope that we can get out of that before then. What do you guys think? Questions?
When will do we expect to see mortgage delinquencies?
That's a very good question. So right now, one of the interesting aspects of this, and Sean and I were talking about this. Sean, are you still in the you're still in the 2.5% mortgage club with me, right? You're in that low level. So Sean and I were talking about this, and this is one of those things, and we joked around and said that this is going to be, I mean, I told him they can pry my mortgage from my cold dead hands because it's 2.5%. And I think that right now, because there is a very low inventory, there's historically low inventory, and housing affordability is very, very low. If we look to price to rent ratios, it's as low as it's ever been from an affordability standpoint, meaning it's very hard to buy. And a lot of people are holding off from even offering their homes for sale, which means that the number of people who actually have these higher numbers, 1%, 2%, 3% of the total mortgage holders have these really, really higher rate mortgages because they bought now, they bought recently. Now, this is the really hard part. You need churn, you need inventory churn, you need people to move in response to get, this is how do I put this nicely? To see a drastic change in the nature of how the mortgage market is structured. You need a lot of people who are holding low rate mortgages to take on higher rate mortgages, which has a lot of other price effects. But we're not seeing that because low inventory, real estate churn, therefore isn't that high. People are hesitant more than ever before to move to other places. And that was actually another data point that's relative. That's really interesting. Oh gosh, this is some cool stuff. So Albert says, paying 2.875% on a primary here in San Mateo, you will have to pry from my cold dead hands. Exactly. The cold dead hand mortgage club. That's what we'll have. It's like it's an all-inclusive club, but one that we hope more people can join. So Sean's absolutely right. Lack of inventory is a reason for price support. And that's the hard part. The longer prices remain high, though, the longer we have mortgage rates remaining high, just because of inevitability, churn, other things, people looking finally and saying, I would like to buy a home no matter I've been waiting 10 years for this. You're going to see churn happen and also more pain happen with those higher rates. The payments, Sean points out, to move up and even lateral moves change too dramatically, preventing most people from being willing to sell their properties unless it's a major life event. Absolutely right. Albert says, us 2% folks gather together with our monocles, champagne, and caviar and boast how the government pays us to live where we are for the foreseeable future. Yes, pry it out of my, I was really selective. You're both trapped, but if trapped in a gilded cage of a 2% mortgage. Collins says, is there any such thing as auto loan backed security? That's a really good question. So if it's a payment, yes, so in short, so if you've got a stream of payments coming through, I can package that. Not me personally. This is not a business attempt. Finance can package that and turn it into a security. We can securitize anything with the payment structure, Colin. So if you've got things, make it happen. And how are we going to buy this? So the question is, would auto loan tranches to carry on this potential conversation be as dangerous as, are you pointing out that perhaps the auto loans being held at banks might be more risky than they seem, Colin?
I mean, leading to our future topic, banks seem pretty risky right now. I'm just saying.
Oh man. Yeah, Colin called it. He sent an email out and he's like, I don't know if First Republic's going to be around by our next meeting. And indeed, May 1st, as if signaling the start of the Albert's list, May economic month, it of course failed. When you lend money to your family. Oh my God, you guys are right. This is great. So in other news, so let's talk about that yield curve, and then we're going to go to banks. I want to hop on Colin's bandwagon here. So the yield curve right now, yield curve, of course, when the government spends more money than it has, it issues bonds, and everybody buys them. You buy them, we buy them, investors buy them, global investors buy them. They're held in your pensions and your 401ks and everywhere else. But the point is if we collect all the maturities on that debt, bonds are, of course, what we call a fixed income security because they offer a coupon payment that stays the same, even as rates change over a period of time. However, the value of that bond goes up and down depending on prevailing interest rates, what investors expect to get. And right now, if we look at our yield curves right now, back in 2021, on December 31st, we had what's called a normal yield curve. We were upward sloping, which means the higher interest rates were reserved for longer terms. Right now, as in December 31st, 2022, that flipped. We had a downward sloping yield curve, something that's predicted 8 of the last 8 recessions. And then in March 31st of 2023, another downward, or even more downward sloping. And right now, we were just talking about this because I'm also on a foundation investment committee for our Museum of New Mexico Foundation. And particularly the period between 4 weeks and about 6 months is just, wackadoodle volatile right now. And look at that slope in the blue line. Not only is this inverted, but it's supremely inverted, which means that you'll get a 4.9% annualized rate on a 6-month bond, but you'll get like a 3.8% rate on like a 2-year, a little bit more than that right now. It's more of a 3-year. But the long story short is that's highly unusual in indicating that the market is implicitly predicting that these rates will go down. And what's going to cause those rates to go down? The Fed responding to negative economic environment with the recession. And so right now, the general thinking is this hasn't been wrong yet. It might be wrong. It'd be very hard for all these things to be wrong, but it does indicate too that a recession might be on the horizon. So, of course, we looked at the banks already. You've read the write-ups across the board from Silicon Valley Bank all the way over now to First Republic. These 3 huge bank failures that are fundamentally significant in our system. What does it mean for our banks? Are we in danger? And we talked about this last month, but it's also something that I think I want to reiterate in a few different levels. So the first thing is, one way that we measure how a bank is doing in general is through something called the Tier 1 capital ratio. That is how much capital we have as a percent of our risk-weighted assets. Now, this is determined by a series of guidelines. We have the Basel II, Basel II, Basel III. These guidelines create a system that allows banks at target level to figure out, how much capital they need in the event of a crisis. In 2008, of course, many banks were not capitalized well. That means they had a lot of loans out there and not enough capital to back them if something bad happened. And so that's one of the reasons we had such a significant banking crisis in 2008. Lending dried up. We went into the Great Recession, and then we had all these programs to get us out. We had stimulus that wasn't the level of stimulus we saw for the COVID-19, but it was incredibly significant for the time. We had the Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP, and that allowed banks to take out loans from the government in the form of the government received preferred stock in return for giving the banks capital. The banks then bought back the preferred stock, paying back the government when it was able to navigate trickier waters. TARP reached a slight positive balance. They made a little bit of money off of that program in general, but many banks, of course, did fail. So after the Great Recession, and due to in part to really, really cheap capital, so we had 0% rates for a long time. We have a lot of things that were happening that kept the markets going and humming along with liquidity. What happened was Tier 1 capital ratios shot up across the banking system. Banks restructured. They're like, whoa, don't want that to happen again. And so we end up at these really high Tier 1 capital ratios. That makes U.S. banks uniquely well positioned to handle another recession. And even through 2022, at least the fourth quarter of 2022, Tier 1 capital was still humming along at about 13.7%. Pretty good, in the words it is a solid system. But there are cracks, and where the cracks happen are a lot of things to think about. There are, of course, as you've all read and you know about, the FDIC insures deposits up to $250,000. When you hold more than that amount of money in a bank, you end up in a situation where that asset may not be fully protected. And as a consequence, investors have been rooting around looking for these banks that might be prone to runs on their deposits. When bad news happens for a bank, large depositors remove their funds. They don't want to lose that money, and they put them somewhere else. And that may inadvertently drive that bank from being in a good capitalization to a bad one. That happened exactly to me when I worked for a bank called Sovereign in Boston back in 2008. It ended up falling below the capital ratio. I had just started the PhD program because I was like, I'm out of here. And it was really, really rough. And what happened is that our two largest depositors were the state of Massachusetts and the state of New York. They pulled out in response to the stock price dropping in a day, which they took as indicative of underlying stresses of the bank. That put us in a bad capital position, and we were bought by Banco Santander, the Spanish bank that bought us for $2 a share instead of the $40 a share they were going to purchase us for just 2 years prior. So it can be really, really interesting how banks move in response to these things. So when we think about banks, when you're looking at the bank response to the last 2 months, what happened was, starting with Silicon Valley, they of course had a unusual banking model, more common of course in the Bay Area, and some banks that have a lot of exposure to venture capital and other places. They have a lot of depositors who have very, very high uninsured deposit levels. With technology, they can remove those deposits very quickly if they sense their deposits might be in trouble, and bank failures become almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. In response, the Fed opened a line of credit open to these banks to help back their deposits. That has since stabilized a lot of the issues we had in March, but we're going to see more failures happening down the line, probably from time to time based on these circumstances. So net percentage of banks tightening, and we'll talk about what this means. So what's the big deal here? So a couple banks failed, they're really big, but they're, primarily operating in a space of VC providers, other things. And the thing is what does this mean for me? And the interesting part is how banks respond to the perception of fear. And one thing that they do logically is they look at this. Bill G says, FDIC is broke. That's a good question. They certainly can't back the deposits of the entire country, even though they kind of alluded to the fact that they would be a little bit kinder than they normally are for those things. They're trying to stabilize the markets, and it won't come to that, but they're trying to communicate that they will insure as many deposits as they can. But it does present, of course, an untenable situation. Colin says the FDIC can just make a call to the Treasury. Hey, Janet Yellen, can you fire up the money printers? And they'll say, maybe. We'll see if they're working. Sorry, we don't work on the weekend. But it's going to be one of those things that'll be really interesting to see how it pans out. Yes, but don't tell anyone. So this is going to be really hard to see. So we're in a better fiscal space than we were before in general, but any bank is potentially vulnerable. And yes, that's not inflationary at all. Just add zeros to whatever you want. That's great. Well, then we're back into the inflation problem again. So banks outside the top 25 account for 67% of real estate loans and 70% of construction loans, 90% of loans secured by farmland. The United States has a very unique banking structure relative to other countries. Even Canada has a much more consolidated banking system than we do. And this goes way back in time. We had the Wildcat era, pre-bank regulation, 1830s, 1840s, where fully 1/3 of banks that were created were completely fraudulent, meaning that people were coming across and saying, I'm going to take your deposits. And then they ran away because they had some people put their bank deposit slips located on inaccessible wilderness islands, just so depositors wouldn't actually visit them and they could spend that money. So the Wildcat era was met by this response from people to actually and they started things like credit unions that were founded by people and workers to get together and stay safer from overall and stay out of sort of these corrupt institutions. But it took us until the 1860s, it took us until the Civil War, and only because people were hoarding money that the government needed to spend to actually indicate a desire for banking regulation. And that was our first venture into it. That was then reformed in 1913 and a bunch of other places that have come up since then. So interesting story over the long run. And that's that's a side frame. Then this is good. Sean says the problem is regional banks didn't hedge interest rate risk. That's true. Silicon Valley Bank uniquely did not. That were paying interest rates lower than the higher interest rates. That's true. Hedging is a big deal. And that's the other part of this too, is that the drawdown of bank deposits has been happening for a while, about a year and a half. Money market funds have done this. People have put their money in money market funds. Deposits have gone down and banks have had a hard time meeting that. Colin says off topic, but I'm curious how much of actual money is physical. Not only do we have fractional reserve banking, where banks lend out money. He's absolutely right, that's not their own, but we have digital and physical money, where all the actual money in the sheets doesn't actually exist even in physical form. That's a really good question. So what you can do is you can look up, we have different measures of money. We have M1, M2, other things. M2 money supply, less liquid in nature, including M1 plus savings. There's a fun little explanation here about certain things. Let's see if I can find a good link for you guys. That's another thing. And I wish I had more time to, here's some M1, M2 values. Let's see if I can find you a quick link here. University of Hawaii has a nice little website on this. So here's a little quick link about some of these things, about explaining a little bit about M1, M2. And I want to go into this in more detail, but it's kind of neat that you can actually follow this too. But, you know, the thing is we know when we have too much money or too much little money floating around the system, one way to gauge that is the inflation rate itself. And because the inflation rate is still high, suggests we have a little bit more sloshing around than we can actually find a spot for. Interesting. Colin's back online. So the other thing to think about, so tightening lending standards is an issue because when banks turn off the spigots in response to the perception of fear, that can be very deflationary. That reduces loans, that reduces money creation, as Colin pointed out, and that can actually at the same time put us into a recession. And so our bank's doing this. And I showed you this chart last time, which is very interesting. But across the board, we had the following characteristic leading up into the March numbers in 2023. We saw deposit growth over the last year and a half have been going down for these banks, particularly in the first few months of this year. And loan growth, though, has continued to increase. If you reduce your deposits and increase your loans, that makes you less capitalized, and this is unsustainable. And so banks, in response to this, are likely either going to have to boost deposit growth, which many are unable to do. They don't have a very attractive model unless you have there are some banks that are able to pay competitive rates with interest rates, but most are not able to because of the cost structure of these banks. They are able to get a higher margin at these times and good times, but at the same time, not enough to attract depositors. And so even though banks might be doing financially well, they're making money from all of their the interest rate differential that they get from paying very little for deposits and putting their money in things that are higher interest rates. The overall effect is that banks have been unable to entice depositors to keep money in their bank when the interest rates are high. And they've been still issuing loans as a functional amount of income and issuing loans as an engine of the economy. So people, it's your pizza place looking to expand. It's people, there's about $270 billion of commercial real estate coming online this year that needs to be renewed. I used to work in this sector. When you give a loan out, like a $50 million loan out to somebody, most of these are interest only. When they come due, they're often either paid in full, which is rare. Maybe the selling of the company is sold or the property is sold, but they often are renegotiated at a different rate. And this is unsustainable to have loan growth positive, deposit growth negative, even though there's some leeway because banks are more capitalized. Bill G says M2 lowest since decades. Albert says real estate at a discount. That's the enthusiasm that we need, real estate. So the question are banks responding with tighter lending standards? In April 2023 was a great time. We actually had new data come out from the Senior Loan Officer Survey. And in the Senior Loan Officer Survey, the engine of a lot of our small and midtown economic growth in areas is banks across the board tightening lending standards on C&I, commercial loans, industrial loans, firms of all sizes seeing tighter lending standards. Over the first quarter, banks reported tightening standards for all types of commercial real estate loans, particularly pronounced in mid-sized banks in response to the fear that they have. And there we go. So, and this is really interesting. So here's a fun little thing for you. When we talk about real estate cap rate spreads, what are you talking about, Riley? What's this? And can I drop it in a conversation at the water cooler next week? Yes. So when we talk about cap spreads, this is a very useful thing to tell us, because what this does is it shows us when the spread is higher between the real estate cap rate and the US Treasuries, this indicates the greater likelihood of making money on a real estate transaction. So those high numbers, those peaks that you see in this chart at the left are good times to actually go out and invest heavily in real estate from a banking perspective and other things. When rates go up in value, but real estate returns go down, this reduces this cap rate spread. And what this does in December 2022, our numbers, and right now in the early part of the year too, have continued to be really, really low. This usually spells kind of a warning bell around the real estate market, because of course, we go back to 2004, 2005, 2006, 2 years before the crisis happened. To the previous point, Albert had mentioned in the chat about how things unwind slowly. we were there years before the 2008 financial crisis, looking at real estate and the returns from real estate and saying, this isn't working. And then we look at vacancy rates. Office vacancy rates are up. This is a problem. And commercial real estate in particular hasn't fully adjusted to the new environment, the potential work from home environment, or the lack of work from home environment that you might be seeing. But certainly the adjustments that are being made in offices are resulting in higher vacancies, not least as manifested by the write down in value of some San Francisco office properties. And for those who don't know, cap rate, oh, thank you for talking about this, Sean. I'm going to write this. Sean brings it out. Cap rate is capitalization rate, which equals net operating income divided by purchase price. Oh, thank you, Sean. I avoided the definition. Thanks for dropping it in for everybody. But yeah, net operating income divided by purchase price. So when cap rate minus treasury rate, when the difference between these two rates is small, that's not promising for real estate returns. So right across the board, though, retail was holding, industrial has gone down quite substantially. And for vacancy rates, industrial vacancy rates are low, which is good. Retail rates are choppy, but I'm looking to see if we look towards retail and office in particular, as consumer spending adjusts, we might see an upward trajectory there. Albert says, is that why Elon Musk and Sam Altman are comparing working from home to the original sin? Yes, Elon calling it immoral, I believe. It is morally wrong, Elon Musk said, to engage in working from home. Do they have commercial real estate holdings? Of course, no doubt. No doubt, of course, right? And so not financial advice, obviously, but what do you say about investing in REITs given the volatility? Real estate investment trusts or REITs are holding companies that operate different levels of REITs. And as I would say with any complex question, as we talk about in the student portfolio or any other things that we do in class or in the field, it depends on the REIT. So there are good REITs and there are not so good REITs. And some REITs have really good, you look at things, you're like, I'm going to invest in a REIT. And you say, oh my goodness, look at this. REITs have some interesting characteristics, right? They have to pay out the profits they have with the exception of 10%. So they can be really profitable and offer you really big dividends. And they look really nice, but at the same time, they have these other issues, and it depends on the industry you're in. There are mall REITs that are terrible, disasters, and there are mall REITs that are really well positioned because they're doing things that re-envision, say, what that space looks like. So REITs are not, without painting a wide brush, I'm going to dodge the question aside and say, look into the detail as to what their holdings are and what their values are, because we were going back and forth with a friend of mine on one that we were looking at, from a casual investment perspective, and we're like, this seems undervalued, but I'm like, I think it might fail, and it did in turn fail. We were trying to figure out though if the CEO of that company had indeed a plan to move forward with their transaction, or whether or not they were going to actually liquidate, and they chose liquidation. And office REITs, Bill's right, getting crushed right now. They have friends, and this is true. There is relationship management is the backbone of banking industry. Too. So it's really interesting to see how this is going to pan out. Also, number of listed companies. So another thing to think about, I'm just going to drop in here for your discussion. Right now, we've been kind of flatline on publicly traded companies. Since the last 20 years, we have about 6,000, a little bit less before, but around 6,000 publicly traded companies. A lot of energy has gone into the private equity market. And where is private equity invested in? Heavily in tech. About 36% of private equity valuation is in technology, not least because it is an engine of future growth, but this too is affected by these circumstances. And the explosive growth of PE as an investment for foundations, 401ks, and everything else in between means that they're held in more places than ever before, and they haven't really faced a recessionary consequence yet. But we're going to talk into it yet when it's at a certain level. Yes, PE's been around forever, but in the scale that we're talking about investors looking at, and in the size of the PE relative to the portfolio, this is really a factor of really low yields that have been happening. Oh my God, you're absolutely right. M&A is weak, Albert says. IPOs are not happening at a feverish rate. True. Why go public when I can get all the money from PE? What is more shocking is who's going bankrupt these days. Vice News, Bed Bath & Beyond. I know, 20% Bed Bath & Beyond coupons. Albert points out, if you have been holding them, what is their after-market value? Can you get rid of them? A flood of Bed Bath & Beyond coupons. Triple B rated. Bed Bath & Beyond.
Quick pause regarding the bank stuff.
Yeah.
Maybe I missed it before March, but we just had 3 regional banks fail in 3 months. I don't know if banking failures are on a monthly basis are the norm in finance, but I would hope not. So should we be worried? Does this, speak to an underlying problem with the banking industry, with finance as a whole? Are people's money safe? Should we switch to JP Morgan or sell our souls to Wells Fargo? What's going on here?
Colin asked for the bottom line, and I'm going to show. So in reference to, Sean hit the nail on the head in the comment section a little while ago about these banks in general. While I'll continue that in general, banks are quite good. The banks that have failed for pretty good reasons. Banks all maintain a certain ratio of depositors who are insured and those who are uninsured. Uninsured depositors, because they're also very wealthy, they have a lot of money and a lot of mobility and a lot of choice. They move money in and out, and good fiscal management is maintaining those things. And what we've seen, to Sean's point, was, hey, these banks didn't hedge well when interest rates rose heavily. And that is a factor. If you draw the line between SVC to First Republic, you find a series of banks that didn't do a lot in the way of hedging. And this is a really interesting phenomenon. There's a good chart. SVC in particular was famous for this. And it's an issue that is profound in a lot of banks, and it can affect any bank, but the likelihood of any bank, there's not a mass crisis. There would have been a worse economic situation had the Fed not opened up their coffers for smaller and regional bank lending. Normally, the Fed only operates and speaks to the larger banks and overnight capacity by offering lines of credit and other such vehicles to mid-sized banks. They're able to stave off what could have been a much worse depository crisis. So we're okay, but I think we're going to see more failures. This is abnormal to see banks fail this big, but it's also abnormal to see banks structured that way. And then you're going to reach a untenable economic situation at some point. And I guess you should have seen rates going up and you should have responded accordingly. Hindsight's 2020, and the banks did have compelling reasons to operate in the field they did. A lot of people, you don't see it coming until it's too late. So I'm not going to defend the bankers, but I will say that it's going to be a problem. There's other banks out there which have not failed that are also in a similar position, but they haven't. The market eye of Sauron hasn't yet focused on them and burned them. And I think the market's going to be discovering those banks, and it will happen periodically. But it's not a functional crisis of our system, but this is not a credit crisis. This is a bank fiscal management crisis. And that's a differentiation from 2008. In 2008, we thought we had all these assets that were this risky, and they're this risky. And then it was like, oh, everything's on fire. And now it's more like, okay, what'd you do in response to higher rates? Well, nothing. And then as a consequence, the investors realize this. They force the bank down. Depositors then, with the blink of an eye and the magic of technology, move deposits out to other places. So it's true. Shadow QE, Bill points out. True, too. Fed opened up home loans for banks. Interesting.
So do we expect the trend of, one bank a month to continue?
Are you asking me for a rate of bank failure? That's really, I just want to know, Colin. I mean, so here's the hard part. So that depends. So if we're able to, let me ask you this, it depends on the scale to which a non-credit crisis could become a credit crisis. And a credit crisis would only occur if the delinquency rate shot up drastically across the board. They're not there yet. I think then you're looking at a different tranche of banks. So if you're looking at this cyclically, the market is looking at those banks that were ill prepared for the interest rate increases. And then you have this other thing. If I'm really painting a picture down the line, then, if the economic conditions turn and we're looking at more drastic situations, you'll be looking at questions around bank credit issues with reflection to banks that might operate in spaces that are not hedged well against automotive delinquencies, other consumer loan delinquencies. They took a big risk by buying a lot of credits. That could happen in a typical way. But I think you're going to see some shakeouts that will continue. To the level that we've seen, I don't know, but I mean, anytime you see the market hit with something, it's usually for a pretty good reason. Putting a chart, you see where SVC, First Republic were on the nature of how uninsured deposits relative to the percentage of their overall deposits were. Like they're in a small group of banks operating in a very risky space that were prone to this. So it's not systemic by any means. And if you're the Michael Burry of the situation, that's why Michael Burry was like, I'm going to go out and buy regional bank stocks because they're undervalued, because they're actually financially solvent. So opposite problem, we're okay, but keep an eye on that credit quality over time. Colin and I made a bet on Credit Suisse. I said it would survive. He said it wouldn't. Now I'm a bowl of ramen. Oh man, Colin is just hitting it out of the park with the bank failure predictions. Colin, what's the next one? Maybe I should ask you, what do you think? Where are you looking? Where's the eye of Colin looking for?
Yeah, PacWest.
PacWest. All right, Albert's list. You've heard it here first.
And of the large ones, I think Wells Fargo would fail before any of the other ones.
That's really interesting. You're right. Yeah. PacWest, Western Alliance. There's a few of them that are out there. Although KeyCorp went up a little bit, I see. That's interesting. PacWest. Let's keep an eye on the market. See what happens. I don't know how U.S. rate hikes cause. Yeah, Credit Suisse, by the way. So that's really interesting. So this question, Colin, that you asked, that you posed here has been very amusing. And I actually got on the phone with my Swiss colleague who's at the Swiss Finance Institute. We went to the same PhD program together. So I just gave him a hard time and he's like, oh, America. And I'm like, it's not. All right, listen, buddy, you've had 15 years of declining credit quality at Credit Suisse. And as it turns out, the US it's not the US's fault, but concerns in the banking industry did lead to that. But in terms of the decisions about why CS was in that position, it was not entirely a US phenomenon. It's like you can't blame us for your poor risk decisions in the long run. So anyway, just things to think about. But I want to go quickly into artificial intelligence, and we're almost out of time. So artificial intelligence, we talked about briefly, and there's a few things that I want to elaborate on this further. So if we go back to 2017, Price Waterhouse came out with this report, and they're like, it's going to be a $16 trillion industry by 2030. And the thing with this is you're operating in a space right now where everybody who's in technology, you've operated in the space, everyone understands the boundaries of AI. Why is this such a big thing? ChatGPT was the aha moment for a lot of people, and it was the catalyst for further investment in this industry. And if you look at us overall, there are some concerns overall. If we look at the industry as a whole, China as a whole versus the rest of the world has been much more proactive about putting industrial robots and other automated equipment in factories in general. But also one aspect about ChatGPT in the information age is, of course, there's also people who look at, the explosion of AI has costs, and one of those is energy. Energy right now, CO2 emissions are still a really big deal. And I think this will be reduced as the energy mix continues to change and we get more, we get over time that movement towards renewable energy continues, and this will reduce the CO2 input. But right now it is a really interesting concern. So if we're looking at one of the opportunities for AI in general, we've been at since the beginning of the pandemic in a very a languishing productivity market. And one of the things that's really characterized the US economy and led us to a position of strength in the post-war era, and even when people have called for the US economy's demise previously, we are able to productivity increase our way out of it through technological improvement, other things. And since the pandemic, and people are pointing a lot of hands and a lot of fingers, I should say, in a lot of different directions. Is it working from home makes us less productive? Is it the overall sense? Is it the lack of pay? Is it the inflation? Is it the overall sense of impending doom that's causing us to not increase our productivity level? And I'm pointing out specifically to the very far right of this chart where productivity has remained relatively flat. Now, it's been flat. It's unusually flat. It does happen to be kind of flat, though, following recessions typically. There are job market adjustments that happen, and recessions are often a starting place for it. I think AI does present an opportunity. And ChatGPT uses so much water. Notice agreement of Wells failing given their myriad of ethical issues in the past 5 years. So when we think about AI or potential technologies, it is cited in one of the ways that it's viewed as a source of economic growth is often through the lens of, does it improve productivity? And it seems to stand that it might, and it would be able to, in the sense that it's able to sort of solve us out of this sort of the languishing labor productivity that we've seen so far. but that does happen, of course, with jobs. And there's a couple different perspectives on this, and I'll bring up OpenAI, of course, as a horse in this game. But Forbes came out with, you saw there was an opinion piece that came out, you may have seen it. You know, they look at this as a functional impact of something that the freelance economy itself will absorb. We know that about 40% of firms are hiring contractors to replace laid off workers, not of workers. Laid off workers, automation historically leads to more freelancers, and AI helps level the playing field in some viewpoints. And that's a very interesting perspective. The idea that most of our jobs in the future as we present them will be done in a freelance world. And this is also based on sort of how labor is moving. The question is not so much the head count of the employees that you have working in traditional roles, but also the question of upskilling. And so OpenAI, 60% of workers are expected to have at least a 10% impact on their job. 2 in 10 will see about 50% of those work tasks impacted. As Albert points out, not a lot of impact. Woo! If you're a stonemason, stonemasons here, as Albert points out in the Albert's list, any stonemasons? Few of them, good. Few hands went up, that's good. So if you're a stonemason, you won't see a huge amount of impact, but things like everything from writing, programming, information processing, routine work, all that stuff tied together creates a lot of potential changes. And so there's some sobering facts about this. And I want to also kind of bring it off. There's some concern. People are like, is this going to take my job? Is this going to ruin me? And all these things, or companies going to get rid of people en masse? And so if history is a judge in this, and Paul Krugman made this point in a certain sense, and I don't necessarily agree with all of it, but I think he made a very good point. You know, even when we perceive technological change to be revolutionary, it takes a very long time to work its way through the system. Like when we talk about Moore's law, you know, when we talk about the increased computing power, that's an observation made in the 60s. There's that famous quote from Sokov back in 1980, I'm sorry, 1980, that's like, 1987. That's like the computer age is here, but we don't see it in the productivity markets yet. And there's this sense that there is a delay between when a technology is realized and then when, of course, we actually are able to deploy it in such a way that it's able to raise productivity. And that takes decades at times. That's the really interesting part. And it's not that we're functionally looking at this. Obviously, everyone understands AI a bit better now. Everyone's used ChatGPT. I use ChatGPT. I use it right now. How do I answer these questions from Colin? And I'll ask. No, I won't do it here. This is a friendly environment. But one situation that you have to look at, my students are using it, other people are using it, we're looking at it as universities are looking at it as a system, professors are looking at it in ways to say, hey, I wish this could write my research papers faster. And but the manifestation, it's not quite, it's not ready for prime time yet, certainly, but it does allow us to dream of the opportunity where a lot of the menial aspects of our jobs can be replaced. Now, the answer to this question is not to view it as necessarily, I think, as an enemy. You won't see wide-scale job replacement next year, even with the accelerated interest in investment in the AI space. What will do it, though, I think, is it'll manifest itself in different ways. So right now, for instance, I'm hiring somebody, for a curriculum and an accreditation specialist. It's likely that in some years' time, 10, maybe 5, 15, AI will be at a level where I can program it so intuitively that it can, determine the optimal structure and do a lot of these things myself. And in which case, then I wouldn't rehire if that job left. A good example back in when automated switchboards existed for telephones, right? We know that was invented in the 1890s to automate that service. People were still employed in the switchboard industry through the 1980s. And it's a very interesting industry. It took 90 years to work that through the system effectively. So Albert says, are your students using it and can you tell? Yes, they are using it. Can I tell? Sometimes. Will you mark them down in their grades if they do? Depends. I think the general feeling right now is education as a whole has to adapt to the question of AI, certainly, right? And you have to do it. You have to ask questions that involve critical thinking in ways that AI can answer. Say, answer this from the perspective of your personal experience, for instance. And there are ways you can get around this. And I think ultimately our ability to manage AI will be a net improvement for our economy because it will deal with a lot of the other stuff that gets us lost in the weeds, and it can be more effective that way. It's easy to imagine, for instance, going through a training program where you're trying to become a veterinarian, where it's a very hands-on, you go through a lot of training to look at all these other effects. You develop an AI technological model that can create an assessment of whether your dog is healthy or not. And then your job then is not training a vet to know all the things, but to know how to interpret the AI, how to manage the AI, how to input the AI, and how to be really good at those things, which requires a completely different set of training. So that's a really interesting thing. This is really, really, it's going to be a phenomenon. Oh, cool, Bill. I appreciate that fun fact. Farm tractors contributed to the Great Depression. That's cool. Bill just dropping in the fun facts throughout this. So it's going to be interesting, but overall expect impact will happen, but it'll be much more pronounced over a longer period of time. And this goes right across the board from even computers, something we saw as being relatively quick, but at the same time, AI will take a while before we realize and marshal its full potential. And I think that timeline is longer than what's currently being realized. So I think it's going to have an impact, but you don't need to worry about your given job just yet. Looking at the San Francisco, San Jose area, right now, two things to note. Number one, unemployment ticking upward, 3.4% in San Francisco, Oakland, Hayward, 3.3% in San Jose, Sunnyvale. We're still seeing fallbacks in professional and business services, as well as the information sector, which has since leveled off, but we're seeing consequences. We're seeing more people laid off or fewer people working in professional and business services, all those other jobs that are looking at to support the economy. Some good news, though, for the Bay Area. If you're looking at this, the population decline has slowed. Looking at the Bay Area Council Economic Institute's recent data, the 2022 to 2023 change, while negative across the board throughout the metropolitan area in the Bay Area, the rate of change is less than it was before. And as you've already anticipated, one negative aspect, the last breaking a 2-year period of job growth was March, where the Bay Area had a net loss of 7,000 jobs. What's the best local market in the Bay Area for jobs right now? San Jose continues to rise above its Bay Area counterparts in job recovery. So far, overall in the market, they ended up being much better. A lot of other people in league for the second and third place, and then San Rafael. Oh, one of the following things. But overall, that's the overall picture of what we got today. Boom goes the dynamite. And look, we got some new stonemasons in the chat too. This is great. Everybody's going to have it. We're going to see some erection of some just immense public works buildings requiring stone throughout the Bay Area shortly. So great job, everyone.
Yeah, but it'll be designed by AI.
It will be. It will be. It'll be designed entirely by AI. You'll be like, this is impossible to build.
I've been watching Boston Dynamics. Their latest robots are pretty good. They're one day gonna replace all this manual labor too.
Thank you, those of you who are able to stick on for extra time. I'm sorry. Anybody have any other questions? Any other things? When do we get our first negative BLS jobs report? I'm looking ahead. Earliest situation maybe this summer, but hopefully we'll be able to hold it off longer. But summer and fall, those are what I'm looking for right now. I'm happy that it's not happened yet. What's your advice to job seekers over the next month from Albert? So one of all, don't get too worried about AI and all, but continue looking at those things. We look at the situation. When you have an opportunity to upskill, do that upskilling, look at other fields, look at other opportunities. But also, if you're looking at a question of do I move or do I not move, know that it will be a bit of an economic ride, at least for the next year, perhaps more. There's a lot of uncertainty in the market and a lot of this stuff hasn't hit yet. So although we're seeing some strains, especially in the tech sector, that may spread to other sectors in the next year. And it certainly would in the event of a recession, which is more than 50% likely. And should I buy a house? Yes, stonemasons need to be hired, says Bill. But again, I can ask ChatGPT, can you sort through these 3 stonemason resumes? And can you tell me which one's the best? And then it'll come out with something. Should I buy a house on the central coast of California? That's a good question. Paso Robles, are you thinking? That's a really good question. That's a highly unique sector. It depends on the house. And is it a good deal, Albert? You can always find good deals in bad economies.
Yeah, I gotta save money for the bad economy.
I like this. This is a big move, Albert. That's exciting. Well, I have to move the economic update figures down. Do I have to get like the I don't know. What am I? Well, like, I don't know what. I have to double check the BLS report that would cover that. Like when it gets, I have a fuzzy area west of Bakersfield. Your peak. Oh,
Oh,
man,
crude oil futures.
that's a commute up the 101.
Yeah.
Look at this. You'll be one of those. We'll have one of those write-ups about the guys with the 4-hour commutes all the time. That'll be fun. That'll be great. Crude oil futures stay low. That's true. One event of a recession is you should see oil prices drop due to demand globally in the event of a recession. That's not really a silver lining, but it might be. A good sense of this, if we compare it, I just did another analysis for this. This is fun. So I have an answer to that. So if we adjust for inflation and we look at previous recessions, oil prices at $45 a barrel would be recessionary equivalent to what we saw in previous recessions where it was around $20 or $25 a barrel. Albert says, do you think we'll see a negative jobs report by the end of the year? Probably. All right, that's a good question. I think there's a greater than 50% chance of that. Will we have a negative holiday season? I think it will. This holiday season stands to snap the streak of greater continuous spending on behalf of consumers, which will have a retail impact. So again, as long as people have jobs, they can spend money or at least take out loans to spend money. The real trouble is when layoffs happen, or if they do become more widespread, the nature of how consumers respond, they will pull back. That will have an effect on the industry. So I think looking ahead, I got some troubles. There are some shenanigans happening this year that might come to fruition, but we'll see. How's everyone else doing? Everyone else well? I got some familiar names in the audience. Good to see you. If I've seen you before, I'm so pleased that you're able to attend. Thank you so much for coming. Anyone else have any questions?
It's transitory. Don't worry.
How long is it transitory for? Could be years. That's as we found out. This is that was also part of that boat, but the best part about predicting the future. Sometimes you're often wrong.
22.5. Wow. It doesn't look like people are dropping questions, so let's do our outro and save it for next month. I hope that was interesting to everyone and you learned something. I myself am definitely learning and working on how I can field interview questions so what can you do that ChatGPT can't? So this will always be helpful. Remember, sometimes it feels like a sinking ship, but we're all paddling in the same ocean. So let's all keep treading and collectively come together to stay informed. This was recorded and will be put on YouTube within 7 business days. So we will look out for that. And please come join us again next month. Thank you, Dr. White. Thank you, Albert. And thank you to everybody for showing up.
Thanks, everybody. Hope it was useful. Thank you so much for coming.